Okay, just a couple of things before we get started, right? So remember that Exploratory Reflection 3 is due on Tuesday, right? And it's going to be just like the first two, but you're going to be dealing with the 5 texts we've been looking at over the last week and a half, right? So starting with Plato, ending with Amy Tan. Anything in that window is acceptable. Does anybody have any questions about the reflection paper? Okay, you're also going to be going back to writing analytically for next time, right? So you're going to be reading chapter 9. Starts on page 242. There is not going to be a homework assignment attached to this. So just read chapter 9. We're going to start talking next week about finding sources for your final papers. And that's what chapters 9 and 8, which I'm having you read out of order because the order they put them in doesn't make sense. Yeah, we're going to start with chapter 9 and then go to chapter 8. They're going to be about finding and using sources. I also want to remind everybody that all unfinished assignments are due tomorrow and that this is the absolute last chance, right? After tomorrow, the window on all of that closes. And if it's a 0, it's a 0. So does anybody have any questions at all about anything that is coming up? About final paper, about missing assignments, about reading assignments, what have you? We're all good? Okay. All right, so what I would like to start with today, as we have been doing over the last couple of sessions, I'd like to start with a short writing exercise because I think it is actually helpful for framing the reading that we're going to talk about. So what I'd like you to do today is to think about and write out a response to the following question. Does our language shape our experience of the world or does our experience shape our language? Why?
What do you mean about language?
I mean like the language we speak, right? So think about your own kind of relationship to language, right? Whether you want to think about, because I know you're bilingual, right? So whether you want to think about your native language or a second language that you speak, right? To what extent do you think your experience of the world is shaped by, like, the grammar and the vocabulary of the language that you speak? Essentially what I'm asking you for here is like a which comes first question, right? Does language affect the way we see the world, or is the way we see the world affected by our language? Just take a few minutes, think about it, try your best. Remember, this isn't graded, it's just for discussion. Take another 2 minutes, 2 minutes or so to think about this. Remember, right, we're just thinking on paper. So what do you guys think? What'd you come up with?
Well, I said that the world shapes our language because, like, depending on where you grow up, it's kind of like language that you come to know. And like, whenever you visit somewhere where they speak the same as you, you're kind of like curious about their language, to like understand what they're saying.
Yeah, things in particular, like things like what we call idioms, right? Right. Idioms, for those of you who don't know, are right, non-literal phrases that are specific to a language or a regional dialect. Right, so those differ from region to region, right? So, I will say, for example, that when I moved down here, half the time I didn't know what the hell people were saying to me because I had no experience of local or regional idioms, right? So it took me a while to acclimate, to figure out some of that stuff. So yeah, so you're saying that that's the way in which our language, the language we grew up speaking, does affect our relationship to the world because it affects the way we can experience other places. Okay. What about the rest of you? What do the rest of you guys think? Yeah, Abdul.
I say it does shape our experience of the world because it helps us understand how different people talk and where they're from.
Okay, yeah. It does certainly shape your responses to other people, right? Picking up on a particular accent or recognizing particular idioms, right, can tell you a lot about a person's background. It can tell you something about their educational or socioeconomic background. It can tell you a little bit about where they're from, right? Things like that. Good. Who else? What else have you guys got? Yeah, go ahead, Martha. Okay. So there is that effect of environment on, certainly on things like grammar and vocabulary, right? That, yeah, you'll use the same grammar and the same vocabulary you hear everybody else around you using. And that this might, on one, it might affect the way other people perceive you, right? But it also arguably affects the vocabulary you have to describe things that you run into, right? So to give you an example of this, I don't know if, I know there was a TV series, I don't think it was successful, about this guy a couple of years ago. Do any of you know who Marco Polo was? Okay, see you nodding in the back, Zane. Who's Marco Polo?
Oh, let's see what he do.
He is not just a game you play in the swimming pool.
I know. I can't remember. He did something.
Okay, so Marco Polo is a medieval Venetian merchant. Who went to China with his father and uncle and had a real kind of facility for languages, for picking up languages quickly. And so he ingratiated himself with the Emperor of China and sort of got leave to go all over Chinese territory, working on descriptions for a European audience of various parts of China, right? And in one of his accounts of his travels, he notes a beast that he calls a unicorn. He says that it has stumpy legs, heavy gray plated skin, and a single thick horn on the end of its nose. So what creature is he actually describing?
Rhino.
Yeah, he's actually describing a rhinoceros, right? But nobody in Europe has ever seen a rhinoceros, right? So because he doesn't have a word for this thing, he uses a word that he does have for something similar, right? This imaginary creature that is also vaguely horse-shaped and has one horn, right? So he uses the language he has to try to describe something he hasn't seen before. What else? Who hasn't spoken up yet? Okay, the two of you. All right, either of you can go first.
Go ahead, Dee.
In my opinion,
Uh-huh.
language shapes our world first.
Okay.
Because if you get to know someone who speaks the same language as you in the world, you can interact with them and get to know the place. Then the experience comes in the place, and you start to change the language based on the experience.
Okay. So you're thinking, again, in terms largely of kind of personal relationships and experience of other people. Okay. What about you, Zane?
Well, I did arguments for both because
Uh-huh.
I feel like you can argue both definitely.
Okay.
But our experience of the world is shaped by our language, since different situations can cause people to say different things and talk a certain way native to the various regions of the world.
Okay. So one thing I'm noticing across the group here is that most of you are thinking about this in terms of interpersonal relationships, and less so in terms of like the resources that a language gives us to describe the world we live in. And I think that the Amy Tan piece is talking a little bit more about the latter, right? So essentially what I was asking you to take a position on here is something that Tan discusses. Tan has she's a novelist, which is an advanced degree in linguistics. It's something that linguists call the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And this is the idea that the vocabulary and grammar of a language places limits on the way its speakers perceive the world. Right? Essentially, that we can only perceive the world in terms that we have language for. Now, the Marco Polo instance would be, say like a point in favor of this hypothesis, right? Another commonly cited point in favor of this is the it's a misconception that certain Inuit languages around the Arctic Circle have like dozens of different words for snow, right? That because snow is so much a part of their daily experience, they are able to describe it in ways that are much more specific than, say, we can, right? Snow in Georgia is something that is, rare when it happens at all. In fact, I think in the 8 years I've lived in America, there's been maybe one snowfall that stuck for more than a day. So, Tan is applying this specifically to her experience as a first-generation Chinese American. Right? Her parents are Chinese immigrants. She grows up in a bilingual home. Right? Her parents speak both Chinese and English to her. She primarily speaks English back to them. And they also get frequent visits from family members from China. Right? In fact, the narrative that she uses to frame both ends of this, right, is a visit from an aunt and uncle who have come to stay with them in San Francisco from China. So, what is the big misconception about the Chinese language that's at the center of Tan's piece here? What is the big misconception that she's trying to tackle? What is she saying outsiders tend to say about Chinese as a language? Okay, let's take a minute. Let's go to page 159. And can I get somebody to start reading from I Thought About This Misunderstanding Again? Yeah, go ahead, Kaylee. Thank you.
I thought about this misunderstanding again. Social context, failing in translation. When a friend sent me an article from the New York Times Magazine, 24 April 1988, the article on changes in New York's Chinatown made passing reference to the inherent ambivalence of the Chinese language. Chinese people are so discreet and modest, the article stated. There aren't even words for yes and no. That's not true, I thought, although I can see why an outsider might think that. I continued reading. If one is Chinese, the article went on to say, one compromises, one doesn't hazard a loss of face by an over-emphatic response. My throat seized. Why do people keep saying these things? As if we truly were those little dolls sold in Chinatown tourist shops, heads bobbing up and down in complacent agreement to anything said. I worry about the effect of one-dimensional statements on the unwary and guileless when they read about this so-called vocabulary deficit. Do they also conclude that Chinese people evolved into a mild manner of life because the language only allowed them to hobble forward and mix words?
Okay, so we can stop there for a second, right? So what is she arguing is the basic misconception that outsiders, particularly Americans, make about Chinese culture? Yeah, that the Chinese are discreet and modest, right? Right, that they're very careful with their words and humble, right? And what is the evidence that this piece cites for Chinese discretion and modesty?
Wait, what was that? I'm sorry.
What's the evidence the piece cites for Chinese people being discreet and modest, or speakers of the Chinese language being discreet and modest?
That they don't have a word for yes and no?
Yeah, that there's no way to say yes or no in Chinese, right? Now, one thing that this indicates is a superficial understanding on the part of the writer of the article Tan is referring to of how the language actually works, right? She explains this near the end of the article, right? There's no general word yes or general word no in Chinese, right? That much is true. But that doesn't mean it's impossible to say yes or no. If we look on page 164, right? So how does one say yes and no in Chinese? Ask my friends a bit warily. And here I do agree in part with the New York Times Magazine article. There is no one word for yes or no, but not out of necessity to be discreet. If anything, I would say the Chinese equivalent of answering yes or no is discreet, that is specific to what is asked. Ask a Chinese person if he or she has eaten, and he or she might say, eaten already, or perhaps have not. Ask, so you had insurance at the time of the accident, and the response would be correct or did not have. Ask, have you stopped beating your wife, and the answer refers directly to the proposition being asserted or denied. Stopped already, still have not, never beat, have no wife. What could be clearer? So what is she saying? Like, how does one say yes or no in Chinese?
Don't give a direct answer.
Yeah, it's specific to the situation, right? How you say yes or no depends on the question that's being asked. So in fact, there are many more ways to say yes or no in Chinese than there are in English, right? We have these two general words for any situation, but in Chinese, yes or no are tailored to particular questions in particular situations, right? Which she argues is actually more direct, at least if you understand the cultural nuances, right, than simply saying yes or no. So let's look at how this plays out in this, these two little narratives about her aunt and uncle. Can I get somebody to read from the top of page 159 at a recent family dinner in San Francisco? It is okay if you stumble over the Chinese words a little bit.
Okay, I'll try.
Okay, go for it, Deep.
At the recent family dinner in San Francisco, my mother whispered to me, "Sao Sao, brother's wife, pretends too hard to be polite. Why, brother? In the end, she always takes everything." My mother thinks a white Sao and
Expatriate, someone who lives outside their home country.
temporary away from the China since 1949, no longer patients with ritual courtesies. As if to prove her point, she reached across the table to offer my elderly aunt from Beijing the last scrap from the Happy Family seafood dish.
Keep going.
Sao Sao. Scroll Sao.
You can just read the translation, it's okay.
I do not want it, really, I don't. She cried, panting her plump stomach. Take it, take it. Scrawled my mother in Chinese. Full, I'm already full, Sao Sao. Protested weakly, eyeing the beloved scallop. I, exclaimed my mother completely. Spirit, nobody else want it. If you don't take it, I will not rob.
Okay, keep going.
At the point, south side, acting as if she were doing my mother a big favor by taking the rich scrap off her hands. My mother turned to her brother, a high-ranking communist official who was visiting her in California for the first time. In America, a Chinese person could starve to death.
Mhm.
If you say you don't want it, they won't ask you again forever. My uncle nodded and said he would. He understood fully. Americans take things quickly because they have no time to be polite.
Okay, so there are two cultural misunderstandings here, right? But what's going on with this, with the last scallop thing, right? Does anybody understand what's happening there? Why the aunt is refusing the scallop when it's offered, but then takes it anyway?
They won't offer again.
Things like American they're not being polite.
Or at the very least, like it's a different. There is a different definition of politeness, right? So that yeah, the uncle who is Chinese is thinking that okay, the issue here is that Americans have no time for politeness or for courtesy, right? What's happening here is that in China, if someone offers you something, it's considered rude to take it right away. You're supposed to refuse it once or twice, and then accept it, right? Now, that's basically understood to all people operating within that culture, right? That, the cultural expectation is, okay, you offer me that scallop on the plate, I have to say no once or twice before I take it. And Tan's mother, having been outside of China and living in America for a long time, has become impatient with this sort of thing now, right? Because she's been living in a different context. But, this isn't, necessarily about, part of the point, part of the way this deals with the issue of yes and no, right, is that this is all part in, Chinese language and Chinese social ritual of saying, yes, I want the scallop. And anybody else who is conversant in those social rituals knows, yes, she wants the scallop, keep offering it, right? But it looks like she's merely being discreet and modest if you're looking at this from an outside perspective, right? Now we can compare this to the dinner that she has with her aunt and uncle at the end of the narrative here, right? Can I get somebody to start reading bottom of page 164 from As for those who are still wondering how to translate the language of discretion.
Where?
Bottom of page 164.
My aunt?
Pardon?
Which one?
The sentence, the passage that starts with, as for those who are still wondering how to translate the language of discretion.
Okay, as for those who are still wondering how to translate language of discretion, I offer this personal example. My aunt and uncle were about to return to Benji after
Mhm.
3 months visit. After 3 months visit to the United States. On their last night, I announced I wanted to take them out to dinner. Are you hungry? I asked the Chinese. No, not hungry, said my uncle. Grumbly, the same response he gave. He once gave me 10 minutes before he suffered a low blood sugar attack. Not too hungry, said my aunt. Perhaps you're hungry. A little, I admitted. We can eat. They both consented. What kind of food? I asked. Oh, it doesn't matter. Anything will do, nothing fancy, just some simple food is fine. Do you like Japanese food? We haven't had that yet. I suggested. They looked at each other. We can eat. Yeah, we can eat. We can eat, said my uncle. Uncle Bravery. This survival of the long march. We have eaten eight before. I had my hand. Raw fish. Oh, you don't like it? I said, don't be polite. We can go somewhere else. We're not being polite. We can eat it. My aunt insisted. So I drove them to Jiptown. And we walked past several restaurants featuring colorful plastic display of sushi. Not this one here. I continue to say, as if shouting for you from these restaurants, you know, to their last. Here it is. I finally said, turning into a restaurant famous for its Chinese fish dishes from Shandong.
Mm-hmm.
Chinese food, cried my aunt, obviously relieved. My uncle patted my arm. You think Chinese?
Okay, you can stop there, right? Because I think the basic point here is made, right? So this is a conversation that, again, sounds to an outsider like a very kind of not very non-committal, right? But how can we tell that it's not? That in fact, all of the people conversing with each other understand each other's meaning perfectly. How can we tell that she understands exactly what all of these apparent evasions her aunt and uncle are making mean?
Experience. Okay.
Well, think about where they end up, right? Where does she end up taking them and how do they react?
They ended up taking Chinese food.
Yeah.
Yeah, they end up at a Chinese restaurant, right? And how do her aunt and uncle respond to that?
Oh, Chinese food.
Yeah, right? Obviously relieved, right? And her uncle pats her arm and says, "You think Chinese, right?" So she's taken them. She knew where they wanted to go and what they wanted all along through the whole conversation, right? And there are various cues, verbal and nonverbal, that suggest what they want, even if it looks like they're dancing around the point, right? So first off, when she asks them if they're hungry, what do they say?
Not hungry.
They say not hungry, but not hungry, not too hungry,
Perhaps you're hungry.
perhaps you're hungry, right? So that's how they're indicating to her, like, yes, we could go out and eat, right? But it's up to you to say you want to go eat. All right, a little, I admitted, we can eat. Oh, what kind of food? Oh, doesn't matter. Anything will do. Nothing fancy. Just some simple food is fine, right? Simple food probably means something familiar, right? And then when she asks if they want to try Japanese food, she can tell from the nonverbal cues mostly that they don't want that, right? They look at each other. Her uncle says bravely, we can eat it. The aunt says a little distastefully, raw fish, right? So they're not going to say, we don't want that, but they will still indicate to her in ways that she understands, no, we don't want that, right? So she will pretend to take them around to a couple of Japanese restaurants and then take them to where they want to go, right? To make it appear, to make it not look like they are forcing her to go someplace she doesn't want to. So again, like the whole language and the whole language issue and the whole social ritual here, right, is perfectly understood by all the participants in it and would not be regarded as indirect by anybody who is actually conversant in this, right? But to somebody who's just reading it and isn't conversant in these little social niceties, right? It looks like the aunt and uncle are being completely passive, right? When in fact they are clearly indicating to her what their preferences are. So, one of the stereotypes that people tend to have about the English language and about American language is that it's very direct, right? That it tends to be direct. But when we think about some of the idioms that we use, right? So what I want you guys to think of, think of a particular word or phrase that you use a lot that might be confusing to somebody who spoke a different language, right? Think about like a word or phrase that you use a lot that if you translated it into another language wouldn't make sense. So, for example, I mean, I don't know, this might be a generational thing. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this expression at all. If somebody points to you and says, hey, your barn door's open, does anybody know what that means?
Your zipper's unzipped.
Yeah, your zipper's undone, check your fly, right? But it's not literal, right? I'm not telling you to go check your barn door. I'm asking you to check on something that is similar to a barn door that it opens and closes, right? So try to think about phrases like that for a minute that would be confusing to someone who is trying to translate that into English, right? See if you can come up with anything, or try to translate the English phrase into their own language. I can give you guys another example, and this is something that is like even among speakers of the same language who come from different regions, right? I think I mentioned like one of the first days of class, when I first moved down here, people kept asking me, have you found a church home yet, right? Now, what are they actually asking me? Well, that's part of it, right? But often when people ask you something like that, what they're doing is inviting you to their church, right? But they're not going to simply say, "Will you come to my church?" They will say, "Have you found a church home yet?" No? Okay, great, come to mine, right? Like it's an indirect way of making the invitation, right? So I think that when we think about it, English is often less direct than we like to believe it is, right? But it seems direct to us because we know what the other person means, right? If you are conversant in the culture, you understand things that seem indirect to someone else. So let's look on page 162 here. She tells this story from her family history. Yeah, Abdul.
Oh, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
It says, cut your clothes according to your size. There's a phrase that's like, get what you like. I don't know how to translate it, how to explain it. It's like, I will explain it later. Okay,
keep thinking about how you might, what is it, can you say what it literally means in English? Like if you actually translated the words.
Like, it says, cut your clothes according to your size. It's like, it's hard to explain, but I will explain it later.
Okay, and that's exactly the kind of thing that we're getting at, right? Is that it is really hard to explain some of these things to somebody with whom you don't share a cultural or a language background, right? Because they don't make sense when you try to translate them.
Yeah.
So if you look on page 162 here, right? Sapir was right about differences between two languages and their realities. I can illustrate why word-for-word translation is not enough to translate meaning and intent. I once received a letter from China which I read to non-Chinese speaking friends. The letter, originally written in Chinese, had been translated by my brother-in-law in Beijing. One portion described the time when my uncle at age 10 discovered that his widowed mother, my grandmother, had remarried, as a number 3 concubine, the ultimate disgrace for an honorable family. The translated version of my uncle's letter read in part, "In 1925, I met my mother in Shanghai. When she came to me, I didn't have greeting to her as if seeing nothing. She pulled me to a corner secretly and asked me why I didn't have greeting to her. I didn't control myself and cried, 'Ma, why did you leave us? People told me, one day you ate a bean cake yourself. Your sister-in-law found it and sweared at you, called you names. So, is it true?' She clasped my hand and answered immediately, 'It's not true. Don't say what like this.' After this time, there was a few chance to meet her. 'What?' cried my friends. 'Was eating a bean cake so terrible?' Of course not. The bean cake was simply a euphemism. A 10-year-old boy did not dare question his mother on something as shocking as concubinage. Eating a bean cake was his equivalent for committing this selfish act, something inconsiderate of all family members, hence my grandmother's despairing response to what seemed like a ludicrous charge of gluttony. And sure enough, she was banished from the family, and my uncle saw her only a few times before her death," right? So what happens here is that her non-Chinese friends don't understand this euphemism, right? But because she understands the culture, she does get it. She knows exactly what it means. Like, it looks indirect to someone looking in from the outside, but it's not indirect to someone who is actually familiar with these codes, right? And it might help if we think a little bit about some of the Confucian values that we discussed when we looked at Mencius and Sun Tzu, right? Do we remember what the Confucian concept of the world looks like?
Life is a ritual.
Yeah, exactly. Life is a great ritual, right? And these social codes and these little codes of politeness are important because how you are supposed to behave to others is dictated in large part by your place in this ritual, right? And everybody has to participate, everybody has to do their part, or the whole thing comes undone. So the very idea of sort of preservation of social order is based on this notion of these codes of social behavior, right? That everybody has to follow and that everybody has to understand. So, I want to go back to this thing that she says on page 159, and we'll probably sort of finish up around here somewhere, where she talks about how this article in the New York Times Magazine makes her feel. Right? She says, "My throat's seized. Why do people keep saying these things? As if we truly were those little dolls sold in Chinatown tourist shops, heads bobbing up and down in complacent agreement to anything said." Why do you think she settles on this particular metaphor for the way this American writer talks about the Chinese and the Chinese language? She's talking about bobblehead dolls, right? Think about the idea of a doll in the first place. What's a doll? A question so basic you probably never considered it before, right? I know, yeah, that's right. It's one of those things that because you're so familiar with the idea, right? It's hard to know exactly how to describe it. Like if you had to describe a doll, right? How would you put into words what this thing is? Yeah, it's a toy, right?
Human-like.
Yeah, it's basically a toy human, right? It's an object made in imitation of a human being. And because it's just an object, what does it lack? Yeah, life. Right? No life of its own, right? The only life it gets is what life it gets from, a child's imagination, right? The child playing with it. And as such, can a doll do anything on its own? Right? Even dolls that, can, cry or talk or whatever, right? You have to flip a switch to do it, right? Requires some action on the child's part for the doll to do anything. So, no life and no independent will, right? No life, no will, no agency. And a bobblehead doll in particular, right? What's a bobblehead look like?
It kind of has like a certain neck to where the head can just roll back and forth really easily.
Yeah, and it looks like it's nodding all the time, right? Yeah. So what we have here is a description of an object that can do nothing but agree, right? It has no will of its own, it has no life of its own, only what life the person who purchased it decides to assign to it. And all it can do is nod. And where does one acquire these dolls in her metaphor here?
In a tourist shop.
In a tourist shop. Yeah, I think this is also important. What kind of things do you usually find in a tourist shop?
Souvenirs.
Yeah, souvenirs, right? Something to take home with you to remember your time here by, right? So how authentic are the things you usually find in a tourist shop? Mugs, keychains, right? Yeah, little tchotchkes usually, right? Some people collect spoons from various places, right? That's one I've never fully understood, but to each their own, right? But yeah, like the idea that not only are these dolls buyable, they're also cheap and kitschy, right? There's something kind of tacky about them. And by failing to understand the cultural nuances of someone's language and culture, by just assigning to them this blanket definition, they are discreet and modest because they have no specific words for yes and no, right? What you're taking away from them is any kind of complexity that they have as individuals, any real agency that they have as individuals, and you're just presenting them as cheap little commodities for purchase, right? Cheap little objects that you put on your desk to sit and nod and agree with you. I think that's the kind of misconception that she's trying to fight here, particularly by pushing back on this notion that Chinese has no words for yes and no, right? It might not have specific words for yes and no, but it does have particular situational words that indicate yes or no, and particular codes of behavior that indicate agreement or disagreement, right? Okay, so that's really about all I have for you guys today. Do you guys have any questions about anything? Okay, so we'll let you go a little bit early, right? So make sure that you do that last exploratory reflection for next Tuesday. And remember that we are going back to writing analytically next time, right? Chapter 9.